Good morning or good afternoon or whatever time of day it is when you're watching this video lecture for week 14. I hope this week, this Thanksgiving week, has been helpful and restful for you. Maybe a time of reconnecting with friends and family, and maybe a little practice of discernment, which is what I'm going to talk about today. The practice of discernment is central to living the Christian life well. It is a means, some might even say the means, by which we invite the Holy Spirit into the dailiness of our lives. It is how the Christian is called to figure out what matters most and how to proceed. While it is not only a Christian practice, discernment is a practice that's applicable across the board. It does have a particular purpose in the Christian life and the life of the church. I want to tell you a story that may shed some light on the practice of discernment and the discussion for this week. I've already told you that I've been a teacher for many years. In fact, I started teaching in the fall of 1966. Over the years, I have been basically two kinds of teachers. And it is important for you to understand that in both kinds of teacher, I was motivated by a desire to be a good teacher. I felt that teaching was both a call and a gift, my spiritual gifting and my call. As my response to that awareness grew, I truly wanted to live into that calling and out of my giftedness. And my earliest journals will testify to that desire, I believe. The first and my earliest kind of good teacher meant following the rules as closely and carefully as I could. I could tell you a bunch of really embarrassing stories about those early years. Fortunately, those years didn't last too long thanks to a mentor named Harry, who came into my life at a crucial time in my first year as a professional teacher and helped me to think more carefully about following the rules. But I did work really hard at being that kind of a teacher, that kind of good teacher. The second, and I hope current type of being a good teacher is expressed to a great extent, I confess, in ignoring all the rules that I can. I can't ignore them all, but I'm very careful about which rules I choose to obey. I would generically characterize the first kind of good teacher as I teach a subject, and the second as I teach students. Now, I know that's a false divide. There is a middle way that matters a great deal. But if I had to choose sides, it would be on the side of the second. I could tell many better, not altogether unembarrassing stories there as well. The first kind, in my way of thinking, assumes that all students are largely the same, a one-size-fits-all approach. It also assumes that all teachers are the same. Again, a one-size-fits-all response. And it also assumes that students don't really have a life, which is a real tragedy on the part of that kind of good teacher. The second kind assumes that no students are the same, that they come equipped differently with different stories and backgrounds and experiences out of those different life experiences and different homes. And well, you get the point. I could tell you a few stories about how and why I transitioned from one kind of good teacher to the other, but only one story will suffice, I hope. Over the years, most of my students were, generally speaking, like me. That is, white, churched, and middle class. Because I have spent most of my teaching career in church-related schools, most were also Christian. Again, more or less. Not all, but most. There were very few non-Christians and very few students of color. Sadly, I could assume a lot about my students. I was rarely threatened by deep differences. In the last several years, while I was teaching at Warner Pacific University in Portland, Oregon, my alma mater, and the place where I spent 23 years of my adult career and more, the diversity of the student population increased fairly dramatically. And I had several students of color, many of whom fell into that broad and rich category of Hispanic, Latino, Latina. And because most of those were also first-generation students and immigrants, they were more closely tied to their family and cultural traditions, many quite different from my own. Fortunately for them and for me, I had already emerged as the second kind of teacher by then. My favorite title for that kind of teacher is relational. That is, I am teaching students, also known as persons, who bring to the table a great richness that I need to provide space for and learn from. When one of my Latina students said that she would be missing class for a week, possibly more, because an uncle had died, I was, frankly, a bit flummoxed. In my frame of reference, I would define this deceased person, her uncle, as a person, a distant relative. The first kind of good teacher would have been a rule enforcer. The second one helped me to get a glimmer of what was going on and suggested that I needed to pay closer attention and listen more carefully. Family, aka familia, was defined and understood differently in her culture than in mine. There were no distant relatives. There was only familia, and she was expected, and in my manuscript that is italicized and in bold, to attend all the events surrounding this death. Well, what am I supposed to do about this? She's a student at Warner Pacific University, and she's in my class, and she's going to be gone for a week or more. What do I do with that? While at first this doesn't appear to be a theological question, I think the question of hospitality as a practice does move us into considering this as an essentially theological question. It does illustrate what the Bedford and Tanner essays are about. What do we do and how do we respond when life throws us a curve? When the unfamiliar breaks into, challenges, or even threatens our norms? These are the questions I was asking then, and they're the questions that Bedford and Tanner are writing about now. You know, there are all kinds of challenges in the world, and the church is not immune to or protected from those challenges. In fact, I would argue that the church has a responsibility to live with those questions. I think it's what Jesus expects of his church. To name a few, the wide range of emerging definitions of human sexuality, the complicated world of mental health, the questions surrounding church and state, the autism spectrum, even the emerging thinking about how church is defined and practiced and what constitutes worship. How does a local congregation deal with such a list that is already, if not at their doorstep, if not already in the church, is certainly at the doorstep of the church? What about the practice of hospitality in relationship to these diverse populations? This presents the local congregation with a set of really important theological questions. But back to my story. Confronted by the challenge of this conflict with cultural norms, I consulted folks more knowledgeable about the matter than I. I also thought and prayed about it in terms of what I believed about people, hospitality, learning, and biblical teaching. I even thought about the challenge in the context of my commitment to Jesus. I read and I studied, and most significantly, I sat down with the student and we found a way to mutually and satisfactorily accommodate the demands of the course, which were real, and the demands of a different cultural norm, which were also real. In other words, I practiced discernment. We found a way to resolve the dilemma, to honor her and her culture, and to serve the goals of the course she was enrolled in. In the world of Christian practice, discernment is a faithful practice essential to living in the world as Jesus calls us to live. In his last days with his disciples, Jesus promised that he would send the Holy Spirit. Quote, "I will ask the Father, and he will give you another advocate to be with you forever. That is the Spirit of truth, whom the world cannot receive because it neither sees him nor knows him. I will not leave you orphaned." And the advocate, the Holy Spirit, will teach you everything and remind you of all that I have said to you. That's found in the 14th chapter of the Gospel of John, and you may want to check that out. I would also just briefly mention the New Testament story of Paul and the Gentile Christians and the ancient practice of circumcision. The question, simply put, is this: must Gentiles be circumcised, that is, become in the flesh Jews, in order to become Christians? If you haven't read this account, check it out in both Acts 15 and Galatians 2. I suggest that you do that as a model for the practice of discernment. This was a huge question because circumcision is the sign of the covenant. It is required by God. To refuse circumcision is to undercut the law and the prophets. It is the, quote, everlasting sign of the Abrahamic covenant, end quote. Yet, that is exactly what is going on in Antioch and Jerusalem. And it is what is going on there that decides that Gentiles are no longer required to be circumcised. It is an accommodation that is reached through discernment. I really can't even think of much that would be analogous to this kind of a decision. Perhaps you can. Without the practice of discernment, we are often left to our own devices. A church is often left to its own devices, and we all know where that can lead. Few churches, if any, are going to miss these kinds of challenges. Often they are, so to speak, in our collective face. How churches address theological and biblical teachings, shifting cultural norms, and Christian practice will have much to say about the future of the Christian church. Persons in ministerial leadership, whether as clergy or lay persons, in a local congregation will necessarily have to guide a flock they shepherd through these kinds of turbulent waters. How you, as chief formation officers, navigate can and will make the difference. The practice of discernment is the central practice in such matters. I look forward to reading your responses to what I consider to be in the essays that these two persons present us. You choose only one of them, but they're both challenging for the contemporary church. I wish you well. Please be sure to check out the notes that are also located on the plan for the week. Blessings on the journey.